There's been a lot more talk about SST lately, and some of you have been looking at us like,
what the hell is even that?
So let's take a look at what SST is and then why people are talking. SST is a framework for building applications on AWS. Look, we all know AWS is a huge beast. It's a challenge to figure out what parts of it you should be using, how you should be using it, and getting it to play nice with other modern tools. It's not fun. SST fills this gap by taking the small portion of AWS that most companies should be using, specifically the serverless pieces, and creating a modern developer experience with them. The end result is a framework that's productive on day one of your project while retaining all the power, scale, and economics of AWS for day 100, day 1000, and more. So what do you actually get? You get a set of constructs for the things that your application needs. APIs, databases, buckets, secrets, cron jobs, queues, front ends like Astro, Remix, or Next.js. We really try to cover everything. You configure these constructs directly in TypeScript and bind them for easy access in your application. All this functionality is wrapped into the SST CLI that can do instant reloading of your application during development, as well as handling things like deploying in production. There are a lot of details here, and our scope is pretty broad because we try to address any problem you might run into in any part of the stack. Which brings us to why people have been talking about SST lately. So we just released SST 2.0 and people are loving it. And the reason people are loving it is we did something you're not really ever supposed to do. We rewrote all of it. Every single line. I know you're supposed to refactor progressively, but every situation is different, and rewriting it was absolutely the right choice for us. We had so many improvements we wanted to make that we just couldn't do with SST 1.0. The codebase wasn't in TypeScript, and that was creating friction whenever we needed to make changes, especially in the most complex places. We didn't really have much of a framework for what we were building, so the features grew organically and coupled with each other in ways that were difficult to work with. We also wanted to really level up performance. Like I said earlier, we're trying to set the bar high, and it's not really possible to maximize performance in an existing system that didn't originally factor speed as a constraint. So we decided we needed to rewrite it while keeping all of those things in mind. It took 5 months, which isn't bad, and thankfully it was successful. We're seeing significant performance gains, and not just in contrived benchmarks. These are improvements that people can literally feel as they're using it day to day. The codebase is now 100% in TypeScript, simplified to a single package with way less code and much easier to reason about. You can see the proof of this in our contribution numbers. People are finding it way easier to work on SST, and we've had more contributors in the past few weeks than we did in the past year. We were even able to spend time improving the UI of our CLI, which sounds weird. If you look at modern tools like Vite or Astro, they provide a slick experience even when constrained to the terminal, and we were inspired by that. SST 2.0's terminal output is much nicer to look at and does things like color code function invocation, so you can keep track of what's going on even when things start to get kind of busy. We also thought about how to make it easier to add SST to your project in the most minimal way possible. We're calling this drop-in mode, and thanks to a new TypeScript-based configuration system, you can drop in a single file to an existing project and get all the benefits of SST without needing a bigger migration. Some of you guys might have seen we already launched drop-in mode for Astro, and we'll be doing additional launches for Next.js, Remix, Solid Start, and more in the coming weeks. So all of this is starting to add up to a pretty good experience. Working inside AWS, you're not used to having tools that feel modern, and we're finally getting to a point where I'm feeling proud of the experience we're delivering. There's still a long way to go. The SST 2.0 is a major milestone in setting us up to do that. If you like how this sounds, give this video a like. If you want to keep up with everything we're doing, hit that subscribe button. Until next time, I'm Dax. This has been SST 2.0. You should go give it a try.
Hey, so good morning, everybody. That was a little video that we put together for SST 2.0. In today's stream, we'll be doing a couple of things. We'll go over some of the sort of main features that are a part of SST 2.0. We'll go over just broadly how to sort of upgrade. It shouldn't be a very painful upgrade. And then Dax will step through the new code base. He talked about this rewrite that we'd been working on for the past few months. One of the sort of core focuses of the rewrite was to make it easier to take contributions. And so we'll go through the code base a little bit to see, what are the different parts of it, and if you wanted to contribute, how would you sort of do that? And then finally, we'll answer any questions. So throughout the stream, if you've got any questions about SST2, about just SST in general, maybe you're new to it, just post them in the chat, and we'll answer them towards the end. that said, let me get started. Let me give you a quick high-level overview of SST2. Let me share my screen here. Perfect. Okay. We put up a new blog post announcing SST2. Again, the video that we have is a good little trailer of just like roughly what's going on. Adam and Dax also did a whole podcast episode on the rewrite process, and Dax sort of alluded to this in the video, but it was a big step for us to essentially rewrite the entire SST to SST code base. And of course, it's a bit of a daunting challenge, but there are some good reasons for why we wanted to kind of do that. And this podcast is sort of goes into depth of that. So it'll be cool if you guys have a second. I'd recommend sort of checking that out. The upgrade guide Frank will sort of step through in a second, but let's just quickly look at what has sort of changed. The big change right up front is this move of going from our sort of package structure, the NPM package structure that we had before. It was under the @serverless stack namespace, if you kind of remember, to this new NPM package that we managed to acquire called just SST. With that change, there are sort of two parts to this. One is obviously the name itself, but two is, we used to have these little sub packages like the CLI, the resources. There was also a node package that you'd have to install sort of separately. And then on top of that, if you're doing stuff on the front end, you have to install this other package, to sort of get your environment variables. We've all put that together in this one single package. So you just need to install SST. If you're using a monorepo and you're using sort of PNPM, which I'll talk about in a second, yes, it gets added to all your different sort of package JSONs, but because it's sort of centrally managed, it is just one install. And we've also done a good job of making sure that the separate packages sort of tree shake in a good way. So for example, if you wanted to import the constructs, you would go SST/constructs. Now, of course, your constructs aren't really being bundled into your function code, so there isn't a whole lot to sort of tree shake or worry about there. But the node package, on the other hand, the SST/node, that needs to sort of tree shake, and that needs to kind of make sure that the dependencies that are being bundled are just the relevant ones. So that's something that we put a little bit of work into. And the same thing sort of applies to what you use on your front end as well. Like we've got these sort of SST end command that comes off of the same package as well. So again, the big change really is this. And so when you're thinking about the upgrade process, really like that is sort of the major one. It's just sort of rewriting or like just changing the imports that you have across the board and in your package.json. The second big change is the CLI. So the CLI in itself, we reworked from sort of the ground up, and there are two parts to that as well. The one big one is the speed part of it. So we really went and sort of thought about, what are all the things that we need to do up front before you can start working on your app. And, there's a bunch of deployments that need to be done. You have to sort of like check what has sort of changed, go sort of deploy that. And then finally the watcher is sort of ready for you. But we put a lot of work into making sure that it gets up and running as quickly as possible, and then sort of checking some of the changes. And that required going through every single step of our CLI boot up process and just figuring out what are all the things that absolutely need to be done, what can be sort of lazy loaded, and how can we get you to the screen, which is where the watcher is, as quickly as possible. So the flow that we were trying to optimize for, that we had in the back of our minds, was you come in, you work throughout the day and you're done for sort of the night or the evening or whatever, and you close down your laptop and you come back the next morning, and when you start it up, it should start up as quickly as possible. It shouldn't go through this whole another deploy process. It should just be instantly kind of on. And that is something that we put a lot of work into trying to get that right. And then those speed sort of enhancements sort of trickle down all the way through. So we spent a lot of work in looking at all the different commands and trying to figure out, can we make this faster? Can we make this other part faster? And if you followed Dax, if you followed us on Twitter a little bit, over the last 5 months, we were definitely very frustrated. We would do all this work, and then we would kind of figure out, hey, there's this fundamental thing that CDK, AWS, whatever, is sort of doing a little wrong. That's making stuff a lot slower. And unfortunately, there wasn't a whole lot that we could do in some of these areas, aside from, tweeting about it publicly or opening an issue on their side. But we've tried to make sure that we've done everything else possible to give you a much faster CLI experience. The second part of the CLI is just making it a lot nicer. So, Dax sort of mentioned this in the video, but our goal is to provide a modern development experience on AWS. And what that really means is looking at the rest of the landscape and basically getting it up to speed in some ways. So when I look at, or when I think about all the sort of AWS tools that are out there, the word modern is far from what I would consider it to be. And it almost feels like, you go do all the fun stuff out there in the world, but when you do AWS, you're just kind of like, I don't know, in the 2000s or something. And that's something that we wanted to fix. So the CLI and the UI that we've put together, we put a lot of thought into, okay, you've got these ARNs, you've got these resource identifiers. Does it need to be ugly like that? Is there a better way? Is there something that actually makes sense to you as a user in terms of your code? Because you're never dealing with these things directly, figuring out how to display that a little bit better. And then just trying to strip away, as much sort of complexity as possible out of the CLI UIs, so that when you look at it, actually makes a lot of sense to you. So those are kind of the big ones there. Then this other piece is the faster live Lambda. Now, if you guys are sort of familiar with SST, or if you're sort of new to it, just really quickly, we have this feature that allows you to work on your Lambda functions locally while still having all your infrastructure deployed to AWS. And so in the past, to make that happen, we used to deploy this WebSocket API and this DynamoDB table to kind of store some information about it so that we can do this sort of proxying effect. And that essentially, was completely serverless, but there's a little bit of sort of a startup time with some of that, the WebSocket stuff. And Dax had kind of a clever idea of switching to using IoT. IoT is something, an IoT endpoint is something that all AWS accounts come with, and it is inherently sort of real time. And so it has a couple of advantages. We have nothing to deploy, and it's actually faster than the WebSocket approach. And so now what we have is, when you run SST dev or SST start, in the past, it used to deploy this extra debug stack. We don't have that anymore. So again, also helps with kind of the faster deployment process, or the faster sort of startup process. But it also ties into the fact that just working on your Lambda functions locally is actually a lot faster than before. The other big change is the way we do config. So we've moved to a completely TypeScript sort of config. And what's neat about this one, aside from the fact that, it's in TypeScript, and so it's you're less prone to sort of making mistakes, it's also the fact that you can define your stacks in line now. So your config can literally be a single file. This comes in handy because of this other thing that Dax sort of talked about, which is this sort of drop-in mode, which I'll touch on in a second. But what this means is that, conceptually, if you think about SST, you have a package.json in your root for your project, and then you just have a single SST.config at the root to define the infrastructure. So it really sort of boils down the concepts required to kind of run SST. This is important because, again, we're trying to reach this sort of modern developer experience, and we don't want you to think about SST, or in the past, how people used to think about sort of CDK or CloudFormation as this big, heavy infrastructure definition thing that you need to do outside of your application, and then you go work on your application. Instead, we want you to think about SST as kind of this build and deploy tool that is just a config, like your Vite config would be, or your Next.js config would be, that sits in your project root. and just defines how how your application gets deployed to AWS. You can go read a little bit more about the config, but that's kind of the big change. The other part that we've sort of changed is how we kind of do front ends. And so first and foremost is we support Next.js 13. If you had sort of caught some of our announcements in the past, we have this new Open Next project that essentially makes it easier to kind of deploy Next.js to AWS. It's an open source effort, and we've talked about it in detail elsewhere, so I won't cover it here. But so we support Next.js 13, we support Astro, we support Solid, and we'll be rolling out support for some of the other front ends as well. So the first part of that is that we support all these sort of modern front ends, but the second part of it is kind of this drop-in mode thing, which coupled with the config that I just talked about, makes it so that, you know, when you're thinking about working on your next app, your Remix app, or sort of your Astro site, it literally is just SST is literally sitting side by side with it, and it's just a way to kind of deploy this thing. There are a bunch of other things. Another big one is we're internally just moving to PNPM, and so SST natively sort of supports that as well. We had to kind of rework a bunch of things to make that kind of happen, but that's a big piece of this. There's some other little ones, like the functions API has changed a little bit. We've improved the way we sort of generate types. We've done a video a month and a half ago on everything that was sort of in SST2, so you can kind of go watch that at some point if you want to sort of catch up on it in detail. And then finally, Seed supports SST v2, PNPM, Node 16 out of the box. So, you know, if you're using Seed to deploy your SST apps, the upgrade process should be relatively straightforward. You just upgrade your SST app and it should just work. And yeah, that's about the main features that we have. You can go check out again the upgrade guide, which Frank will go over in a second. But actually, yeah, why not we just do that? Let me turn it over to Frank, and he'll give you a quick run through of how to kind of upgrade to SST v2.
All right. No one likes to upgrade, so I don't know why you guys leaving the most disliked part for me to go over. All right. So if you had to just go to docs.sst.dev, on the left side, if you've been using SST for a while, you know there's an upgrade guide. I click on it. At the very top, there is a list of things you need to do to upgrade to v2. Like Jim mentioned, most of the changes were really behind the scene to make SST dev the experience faster, make SST deploy faster, in general, just make things faster. But there are a couple things that have accumulated in v1 based on the feedback you guys gave us, and we work through this. We always have the itch on. We are like, we really want to fix this for, just throwing out some names out there for Ross. We really want to fix this for, different people, and we always have to like pile them up because some of these are breaking changes. So it's a big relief on our side to see to get some of these changes out of the way. All right, the first one Jay mentioned is the mono package. If you just go to your package.json, get rid of all the at serverless stack packages and change that to SST plus the construct package. I just remember someone complaining about, I really hate typing at serverless -stack in every single file I have. Now that's only just SST, right? We actually tracked down this really nice guy who owned the SST npm package, and he's really kind enough to give us the namespace. So all right, so now we save how many, like 15 characters per file, so that saves on some typing. I think I'll just go over the top high level points. I think you can just go read the upgrade guide for the mini steps. It seems lengthy, but I try to document every single step in there. But it should be faster than it appears to be. Our app config, if you had SST JSON config, now that's become a TypeScript file. And it never ceases to surprise me just how how people like to customize stuff, and JSON file has always been like constrained. People really want to configure app settings based on the stage they're deploying to, configure the profile they use, the region they're deploying to. And so yeah, it takes pretty much a similar format that the JSON used to take. The name, region, profile should be very familiar to you guys. And the stacks is optional, right? You could just point to the same index file in your stacks folder, or but usually that stacks index file is pretty short. You usually just define some app level default and add a couple stacks. Now you have the option, just define this inline. Cool, let's move on to the CLI. SST start, rename to SST dev. And like Jay mentioned, we got rid of the debug stack. And now we're using IoT in order to deploy. So it needs a couple more IoT permissions. And here's a link to a complete list of permissions that the SST CLI requires to run on your local. All right, now coming down to the stack resources, the one big change we made is not really big, but one major change is on the function construct. We used to have this bundle prop that it takes different value based on the runtime. So even if you're doing Python, it has a bundle field in there. If you do Go, there's a bundle field in there, and it makes the whole thing not really type safe. And people also wanted to expand on this to be able to, Misha mentioned, I want to have the ability to customize all the ES-build configs. So bundle has been removed. We explicitly added, Node.js prop. There's also Python prop. For Node.js, you can, at the high level, you can define format, exclude certain npm packages, like manually install certain npm packages. And you can also pass in the ES-build flag, which takes all the ES-build properties. So it's quite flexible over there. We also took out source path. Source path has been very confusing. So confusing to a point where every time I talk to DAX, we have to go back to look at the code. What the source paths do? It used to do a couple things. It used to implicitly point to where your package.json file was. It's really a bunch of legacy support, and a lot of people misinterpreted source path to be like a prefix to a handler. If my handler is really long, and all my handlers start with services/path, can I just put this inside source path? And usually that causes some issues. Just to get rid of that ambiguity, we remove source path, and you just the handler should be the full path based on the root of the project. There are minor changes in some other construct I'm going to skip over. All right, we used to have static site, Next.js site, and Remix site in V1. Now we added Astro site and a couple other front-end framework sites. And one big change we made is when you run SST dev, what used to be SST start, it no longer deploys entire site. And that was one of the major frustration for people, where we used to deploy like a placeholder site, but to deploy the placeholder site, then to deploy a CloudFront distribution, which takes forever to deploy and forever to invalidate every time we make changes. But the placeholder site doesn't really have anything. It really just have a simple placeholder asking you to go into your front end and run run npm start, or just run startup script. So you're supposed to run your front end locally. Now it brings the question, why are we even deploying a placeholder site? So we took that out after thinking through a couple issues. For example, if you declare the site, and you could, before you could access the sites, the bucket behind the scene, the distribution behind the scene, And you might use that as a stack output, or you might feed that into an environment variable for another Lambda function. But when you're on SST dev, what are those values? Now they are undefined, but you could do undefined or pipe localhost. You can pass in some placeholder value. So whatever used to be in the site props, like site.url, the custom domain URL, site.cdk, all these will be undefined if you're running SST dev mode, which people shouldn't really be using before, because when you're running dev mode, you're really starting your site on localhost. So what I usually do is just change site.url. If it's running in the dev mode, I just set it to localhost as a placeholder. Next big thing that was changed is we completely rewrote Next.js site. Used to use this framework, not a framework, this tool that used to convert Next.js project. Instead of running next build, it packages itself, and it generates some very custom output, and it uses the Next.js serverless output format, and that format is no longer supported by Next.js, and the project has been deprecated or archived. So we have to figure out, what tools we need to use to package Next.js, especially these days. Like, a lot of people coming to us be like, we want to deploy Next.js 13 or 12, 13, and that project no longer supports. So we created the OpenX project. When I say we created, I'm probably just doing half the work. The other half of the work is really done by the community, like by Misha, by Al Capone. To date, I don't know his real name. I keep calling him Al Capone, but a lot of people really being really helpful, contributing to the OpenX project. That, to be honest, like at these like people I mentioned, Misha and Al Capone, they know a lot more about Next.js than I do. So really appreciate they are around helping us to build this project. So if you're upgrading, try out the new Next.js site and try out because how it packages Next.js site, how it deploys to AWS is completely different as how it used to deploy. It should work, but since it's a big change, I recommend deploying to the dev stage first. Click through the pages, make sure if you're using image optimization, that's still working. Certain routes that you really care about them being cached, make sure they're cached. Just test out the most common scenarios before deploying to production. Cool. I think that is the most of the big changes. And again, we removed debug stack. One of the goal we have is for SST to deploy as little extra resources as possible and to keep your AWS account clean. We are moving towards the direction where we should deploy everything in this one CloudFormation stack. Some of you might come across already, like SST Bootstrap. You should find this stack in your AWS account per region. So if you go into a CloudFormation console, you should see SST Bootstrap stack in there, and we deploy a couple of things in there. We try to facilitate SST, and we try to and that is not deployed per app. Again, it's per account per region. So when you deploy an app to SST through SST, we try to not touch much of the resources in there. So what you define in your SST app is what is being deployed. So no more debug stack. I think that wraps up most of the things in the update. I will give it back to Jay.
Oh, yeah. I think it's better we go to Dax. So Dax will go over what are the pieces in the code base, and this is fun for me as well because I wasn't involved in the rewrite very much. So I kind of want to see what did we actually rewrite. So join me in figuring out what did we change over the last 5 months.
All right. Hey, everybody. So we're going to jump into the code base and look, like Jay said, at what the hell I did for the past 5 months. I'm going to be using GitHub because I got their new like search file explorer thing, and I think it actually looks pretty good. So let's try that out. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. And hang on, let me just move around so I can see the chat. Okay. All right. So looking at GitHub, so like Jay mentioned, we did a huge rewrite, major restructuring up a bunch of things. Where we started was actually with the package manager. One of the biggest requests with SST 1.0 was, why doesn't this work with PNPM? It turns out like there were some CDK issues that were causing it to not work with PNPM, but we found ways around them. So I was like, okay, we might as well use PNPM too, because it seems like a pretty good package manager, and it's actually teaching me a lot about how the right way to do things are, because PNPM is a lot more strict. So yeah, we are now a PNPM monorepo. We have the standard packages subfolder with all of our sub packages. And yeah, the first piece was just to restructure it. So before, we used to have a ton of packages here. We used to have, like SST core, SST resources, SST CLI. You would install a bunch of them and then import from different ones. But now it's all consolidated into this SST folder. And this SST folder contains pretty much everything. Like we do have these other packages, but like this is just, create SST is just the like the way what we create starter templates, and we have some adapters for front ends, and we have the console. So not super important there. Most of the code now is in this SST folder. I see a question, what is PNPM? PNPM is an alternative package manager. Instead of NPM or Yarn or any of the others, PNPM is a new one that is very fast and I think implemented very correctly. So, okay, so in this SST folder, we break things down in a pretty simple way, I think. So we have, the source folder where all the code is. The first thing to look at is the constructs folder. This is where all of our constructs are now, and this is why you're importing from SST/constructs. So, all the constructs you're familiar with, buckets, functions, APIs, all of that is in here. There wasn't too much rewriting here because this is pretty much has stayed as is. Just a few things that Frank highlighted, like the function bundle props changing. But in general, it's pretty similar. And then we can look at what's in the rest of the package. So this new system we have in the CLI, we basically kind of treat everything as super modular. The only core thing in the CLI really is, especially during SST dev, is an event bus. I don't mean like an AWS event bus. I just mean within the lifetime of your CLI, there's an event bus that's running. You can subscribe to events and you can publish events. So an event might be something like a file was changed, or like a function invocation has come in, things like that. And all the actual features are implemented as little plugins that will subscribe and emit events and do whatever logic they need to. And this actually greatly simplified, one, just like managing stuff, like everything's a lot more modular, but two, everything is now lazy loaded. And that's the reason why SST dev starts up a lot faster. All these modules don't like load all the way up front. They load as needed. So before, if you did SST dev, like we were booting up stuff that you didn't necessarily even need or use. Sorry, my dog is making funny noises. So if we can take a look at the example of that. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. We can look at a quick example of that here in this watcher code. So this is a file watcher that boots up. We can see that, and this is also using the same context library that we use everywhere, like even our Lambda functions. So we have this thing that's use watcher, and this is kind of like a little plugin, effectively like a little module. And we have a thing that watches all the files in your root directory, ignores some things, and all it does is publishes file change events. So this is completely isolated from everything else. So a key part of this rewrite was defining a lot of isolation, just do little units of functionality. and they'll compose together through the event bus. So if you look at our core here, like we have some of our like foundational things, like Jay was talking about. We have an IoT connection now, and this little module just connects to IoT, and then when the messages come through, it emits those messages to the event bus. We have other things like this little module for credentials. This does all the negotiating with AWS to load your credentials properly. So it's kind of like core, like low level functionality exists at this layer. Things like project, this loads a project, etc. Then we have the CLI folder, and this is where most of the CLI functionality lives. So the entry point is this SST TS folder or file, and we have, we import all of our commands, and this is all defined with yargs. We spent some time learning how to use yargs correctly, and it's actually a pretty good library that's extremely type safe. Like all the arguments we specify, like we can actually get all those in a type safe way in our implementation. So you can see all the commands that we have here. If you go into one of our more complex commands, like the dev command, which we can look into here, you can see like we define, the flags, etc. There's some global flags that come in for every single thing. An interesting thing here, you see we're doing dynamic imports here. And the reason is if we put all this stuff outside the command, it means everything loads when the CLI loads before it even decides what command to use. So if you're just doing like a simple SST command, like SST version, it doesn't make sense to load all of this stuff. And by putting it as a dynamic import, the stuff gets delayed until it actually gets used. So we have a bunch of imports up there, and then we spawn a bunch of little functionality. So the dev command has a function logger. So this thing just subscribes to different function invocation events, standard out events from the workers running locally, when builds fail, things like that. And all it does is it just prints like UI for that. So this is like this function logger just handles UI related to the functions. Then we have another little module that is stack builder. So this uses the file watcher, and whenever a file has changed that is related to Stacks code, it does a work of rebuilding your Stacks code, seeing if there's any changes, and deploying it. And that's a nice little self-contained piece of functionality. And then we have like the local server that powers the console, and then a bunch of other things. Like if you're using Pothos, we have the GraphQL extractor. If you're using the RDS construct, we have this type generator. So all the stuff that you can see is broken up into these nice little things that we're gonna turn on. And if you look at some of the simpler commands, you can see that most of these commands just call into core functionality. So if you look at something like deploy, it's pretty short. There's not that much here. It really just takes the CLI commands, figures out what you want to do, and then delegates to like core library functions. So if you take a look at this deploy many function, this is in the stacks. How do I actually go to this file? If I control click, do I go? Does this work? Oh, here. If I go like that. Did a full page reload, but whatever. This is where we have this like in the root of our package, we have the stacks folder, and this has all the functionality to do different things with stacks, like to build them, to deploy them, to diff them, to monitor their deployment, to remove them, generate metadata, things like that. This separation is nice because hypothetically, if you want to programmatically, if you don't like the way the CLI does something, or you want to like programmatically coordinate something, you can also just import these functions and like coordinate stuff yourself. So everything, you can import the CLI and call it programmatically. You can import the core libraries and call it programmatically. We think this is going to enable some interesting stuff that I know people have wanted to do. It's something that we wanted CDK to support because of the way we do it, or the way we use CDK. So in like programmatic access is something that we think is important. And then I think the final thing is the node package. So again, this is now just a subfolder. This contains all of the code for your Lambda function. So all the service discovery stuff, or the resource binding stuff to access your bucket. It also contains some stuff that we haven't fully released yet. So I think some of you may have seen this before, but we have this whole hooks thing for accessing parts of the event in a useful way. Like you can, if you have an API event that comes in, you can do like use header to get a specific header, things like that. Once I release auth uses this stuff heavily internally. So we're actually going to document all this and make this like a thing that you can actually use. You can use it today. It's just not documented. We haven't done it because we haven't dog fooded it enough to really verify it. But because the new auth stuff does use it a lot, I have confidence that this is a good pattern that makes sense. So a bunch of things are in here, and we have like all these different helpers, and this really just represents stuff that you would import into your Lambda function. We have a few other things I guess I can go into. We have like the handlers, so different runtimes we support. You can see some of these look familiar. You can see there's one in here that we don't officially have released. It does work. We do support Rust. Like this, I got like this version of Rust, like a Rust handler working. It needs some tweaks, which is why we haven't released it yet. We need to document it, and we can release this because I know there's a few of you that wanted to use Rust with SST. But these files are very simple. If you look at, I mean, we can just actually look at the Rust one. If you want to implement a new custom runtime, you really just need to implement a few different functions. So when a file changes, should I rebuild this? You can just answer yes every time, but like, you can do some checks or like, okay, only rebuild this if it is actually a Rust file. You kind of save some unnecessary rebuilds. You need to implement a start worker command, which is how do you spawn this locally? How do you stop it? It's pretty simple. Like you just get the process and kill it usually. And how do you build this? And you can build it for either dev mode, which is still called start internally. We need to change that at some point. And how do you build it for deploy mode? So really simple. Like the whole Rust custom runtime is 100 lines or so. The work is just kind of getting this all working. The actual code itself, like you just have to understand like how do I build Rust and how do I build it for Lambdas, things like that. But once you understand that, this file is 100 lines or so. The Go one is very similar. But this is like 113 lines. So yeah, you can add custom runtimes, and we can support more. We haven't like done too many because I think in practice it's pretty tough to use almost any language with Lambda. Like some languages definitely work a lot better. So we do support it. I don't know how many more we'll end up doing. It just comes down to what people want. And I think that's it. So yeah, overall, this is a lot less code. And it's all in one place. It's pretty easy to discover. If you run into issues, I definitely recommend just poking into your node modules folder and like adding console logs and trying to see what's going on. It's a lot easier to debug than before. We had different packages before, and it wasn't really clear like what went in core and what went in CLI, things like that. But now you have full access to everything. A lot of the debugging instructions I've been giving people when they run into issues, I'll just tell them to go in their node modules and add a log here and tell me what it says. And oftentimes people have been able to figure out what the issue is themselves. And I think that's why we're seeing a lot more PRs. Like we're seeing, if you just look at our history, you can see there's like a lot more faces here. It's not really just, it's a lot of Frank because we're just doing documentation. But if you go back a little, you can see there's like a lot more people here. And like we're seeing a couple PRs every day now, and most of them are pretty good. And you can see, we're up to 139 contributors. We've been pretty like aggressively merging stuff in. I think before we were a little more conservative because people would change stuff in places that we were going to rewrite anyway. So we just weren't accepting as many PRs. But now, like I think we've been accepting the vast majority of them because they're just quick fixes to things. And it's really been helping us not have to spend time like debugging and recreating specific issues on our end if people can just go fix it. So it's like, it's good for everyone. And we're pretty motivated to make sure that's the case. In terms of the rest of the repo, I don't know if there's too much here to look at. Like I said, we have these other packages. We still have our docs in this www folder. People do contribute to these regularly as well, which is always helpful, fixing typos and things that are outdated. But yeah, I think that is it. It's all from me. So this is again review of the new code base. It's a lot better, a lot friendlier. If you run into issues, like I said, if you run into issues, highly encourage jumping in here or into your node modules folder and poking around. It's especially if we're like not able to get back to you right away. It's pretty common that you'll be able to unblock yourself. But I think that is everything from me. I'm going to turn it back over to Jay, and I think we'll do like a Q&A if people have any questions.
Yeah, let's just go through the questions in chat. I think we answered a couple along the way, but apparently somebody was trying to get late into the party. I hope they got in. Let's see.
Why did you say I just opened up a can of worms? What's that in reference to?
Frank, I think you're muted.
You're muted.
No, that's when you said we support Rust.
Oh.
Can of crabs. The crab people are coming.
Yeah, I want to open up a can of crabs.
Yeah, just going.
I don't know if we have too many. If anyone has any questions, like feel free to post it.
Oh yeah.
We'll
Svelte. Yeah, that's on the roadmap. Hopefully in the next few weeks.
Yeah, we were talking about it the other day because I think we did. So we've done Next, Remix, Solid Start, and Astro. Did I miss one? No, that's all of it. But Svelte is like really big as well, especially with their 1.0 release. It's definitely bigger than Solid Start. We only did Solid Start because I personally use it. But it should be pretty easy to add support for SvelteKit, and we'll definitely do that.
Can SST create and manage organizations and accounts? It cannot, but you never know.
Yeah, I think you still are responsible for figuring that out right now. We don't like that you have to figure that out right now because it's pretty easy to set this stuff up incorrectly. At some point, we'd like to make it easier to sign up for a new AWS account and have it come out the box like configured in a correct way. We don't know how exactly we're going to do that yet, but it's definitely a barrier in getting like set up. You have to like show up to SST with a properly configured account.
Yeah, there was a PNPM question which Dax answered, but I just saw another one on why PNPM. Maybe Dax, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so there's two things I like about it. One, it's really fast, and the reason it's really fast is it doesn't. Basically, everything in your node modules folder is a symbolic link. So if you need to like recreate them or move them around or install new packages, it's not like actually installing and moving like this giant set of files around. That makes it really fast. The other thing is it's implemented extremely strictly and correctly. There's an official spec of what how you're supposed to structure packages and things like, anything from how do peer dependencies exactly work and how do you respect different conflicting version numbers, things like that. A lot of package managers don't implement that strictly, whether on purpose or by accident. I don't know what it is. PNPM is very strict about that, and it makes you realize that you're doing a bunch of things wrong. So in the process of switching over to PNPM, I learned, we're like, we shouldn't be relying on this thing, or like this thing is actually a hack. And we cleaned up a lot of stuff. It makes you a lot more organized. So I definitely recommend using it. It's just good.
Yeah, our templates are now defaulting to it, or at least, that you can use it right out of the box. And our docs will try and push it a bit more as well. Yeah, the strictness of it is definitely helpful, especially in the context of something like SST, where you're working with, most likely in a monorepo environment, you have multiple packages. So that's sort of helpful.
I think just to add to that, just for SST, it's more important that we have things that are very strict in terms of node modules, because if say we use Yarn, it's very relaxed, but if end users use PNPM, then things would start breaking. So it's more important for us to use PNPM.
Yeah, but if you're publishing a library, definitely you have to use it, I think, because it just makes sure that you do it right.
Yeah, there's a question about SST with Angular. We haven't gotten a ton of requests for Angular, but it looks like it's making a bit of a comeback.
Yeah, if you search in our Discord, there is a bunch of Angular usage, but I don't think SST needs to do much, at least today, for Angular. Like it should just work because Angular is deployed as a SPA, so our static site construct should just work. And I don't think you're going to run into any surprises there. It's not any different than just using like a vanilla React app.
Yeah, so the static site construct that we have. A follow-up on the PNPM one from Ashish. It's this means that packages not bundled properly could create issues.
It's less that it's strict in that like it won't allow stuff to happen, and more that it's in your face when you're doing something wrong. It'll like give you like really explicit warnings about what exactly is off. In terms of packages being bundled incorrectly, that's a different, like Node.js is complicated, so ecosystem's complicated. PNPM is not affected by improperly bundled packages. It's improperly bundled packages impact like the ES build side of things. When we're actually like building a function for you, like that's when like you might see some issues. But PNPM is more about how like, oh, you're like using this dependency, but you didn't actually declare it in your package JSON. It's working anyway because like some other package also depends on it, so it just happens to be working and it can find it, but you shouldn't rely on it. Like it addresses things like that.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions on the roadmap. So additional AWS constructs, and then also the console. Sorry, and the auth. So the roadmap roughly, and I think one of the reasons why we've had a hard time sort of committing to a public roadmap a little bit is because we learn a ton of things every time we make something, and when it works well, especially. So for example, when we did kind of resource binding, we realized, oh, wow, like this changes our view on how you should be interacting with any infrastructure across the board. And so that made us kind of go change a bunch of other things. And so it's sort of hard to kind of look past a certain point. That said, we do have a little bit of clarity on sort of the immediate roadmap. So the thing that we're working on, and this actually touches on one other question as well, is the question on the drop-in mode for Remix. So the next few weeks to a month, I would say, are going to be just drop-in mode releases for all the different front ends. Again, that includes the Svelte question from before as well. So that's up next, and then after that it's auth. And while the drop-in mode stuff is happening, you'll start to see us roll out auth a little bit and getting it out into people's hands, and then we'll go back and do kind of the docs and tutorials, because there's a lot of that, especially with auth. And then we'll do kind of a release around that. But actually, before I touch on the console part of it, Dax, maybe you want to answer that question directly. How's the new version of auth going?
Yeah, it's going well. So where we are with it is we have now the auth construct will spin up a fully compliant OAuth server. It forwards to other OAuth services like GitHub, Google, whatever. The thing that me and Adam put out, rebase.tv, actually is using that new auth thing. It's like the first place where I'm trying it out. So there's a little bit of stuff I need to clean up, and I think by the end of this week, I can have something usable that has all the same functionality as SC Auth today. So anyone that's using SC Auth today can upgrade to this, no problem. There's still some work that needs to be done, like Jay mentioned, especially on the documentation side. We want to like make a lot of this stuff a lot more clear, because OAuth seems like this big confusing thing, but it's actually really simple and straightforward, and we want to make sure people understand that. But yeah, I'm really happy with this new model. It's way more correct. It's maybe like there's like a range of different ways people use it. I think maybe like this, like the extreme end of like the simplest way people used current ST auth, it might seem a little more complicated, but it's not that much more complicated. And on average, it's going to be simpler. It'll support things like auth thing straight from a front end, or a thing with like a server in between, or like going from a mobile app. It should all just work. It has flows for everything. So yeah, these ones has mobile flows are coming with that. Yeah, it's all web based. So a mobile flow means you're opening like a browser, and it'll redirect back to the app with the token. But it's like just part of the official OAuth spec, where that's how you do mobile auth, at least with OAuth. So I think for most people, they should 100% replace Cognito. And I'm pretty motivated. Like I said, my main motivation is just looking at our support channel, like so many questions about Cognito that we can't really help people with. And the best way I think to address that is not by trying to build something on Cognito, just making it so people don't really need to use it or know it.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because with auth, a big piece is just being compliant so that it works with the rest of the ecosystem. And then two, it's like it is fundamentally better as a serverless product. So there are a bunch of auth implementations out there. There's some open source ones, but they require you to kind of deploy this container or have this like very complicated sort of dependency tree with all these like different languages. And I think the way we're sort of seeing what's going on in the front end world is we're just simplifying a lot of backend resources as a result of it. And we don't think of auth that way, but auth should be incredibly lightweight, type safe, and standards compliant. And that's really what we want to hit with this sort of new version. Going back to the question on the roadmap. So in terms of sort of constructs, so auth is the big one that we're going to do after some of the drop-in mode stuff. And then the console, which there was a question on that as well. We're going to turn our attention towards the console. We want to do a much better job with just fundamentally just logs. So, as we're thinking about these constructs that we have for these modern front ends, they tend to have a couple of different functions under the hood, and debugging them are not going to be fun if you find yourself sort of jumping across, different sort of CloudWatch tabs or whatever. You fundamentally just want to think about, okay, I've deployed this Next.js app. Just show me the issues or show me the logs that I'm running into with it in production. And I just want to have a good view of that. And we want to try and solve for that first and foremost. So solve for that on local, and also solve for it in production. And so that's going to be a big piece in terms of the console. Again, I can't give you a ton of details around it because we just haven't gotten to working on it yet. So can't quite commit to some things just based on that. But that's the order in which we're thinking about. So we're going to have these drop-in mode launches, and then we're going to do auth, and then we're going to look at the console. We do have some ideas in terms of some other constructs that we really want to work on. Sort of incidentally, I think, you heard sort of Dax talk about the event bus and how it kind of plays with the CLI, but there's sort of a similar claim that can be made just for your application in general and making that sort of serverless as well. And so that's an idea that we've had. Not committing to it just yet, but that's something that we have some thoughts around. Let's see what else.
I think one thing we can share about the CLI is we have to figure out how exactly we're going to do this, but we want to make it so you don't need to have something running locally to access the console. So if you want to go look at your production log real quick, like right now you have to like spin up the CLI locally with the console command, which is annoying enough that I literally never use it. And the alternative right now is like click into the AWS console. So we definitely want to make like a version of it that's like hosted and you can just quickly access it. And like Jay said, like really focusing on that logs experience. Right now the UI is like not super dense. It's like not good for looking at a ton of logs or quickly navigating between functions and things like that. So it's kind of narrow the scope to just dealing with the function side of things. That's the way we're thinking about it.
Yeah, I missed a question in between. I think you guys can kind of touch on this one, but it's can I mimic the same experience when deploying Next.js to Vercel, including ISR on demand?
Frank can probably talk about
that. Yeah, how ISR working today is how ISR working on Vercel is that when you make a request, it caches that response for, by default, I think 10 seconds. And after 10 seconds, it still returns the old response while if it sends a request to the backend to generate a new page, so that next time you respond, when you make a request, you respond with a new version. And what it ensures is that every single request hits a cache. There might be every 10th second is technically supposed to return a new version, but it returns an old version. But every version is cached. It works a bit differently on XGS site today, because this exact behavior is, I think it's definitely on the roadmap for the CloudFront team. ADAX kind of confirm that. I think the Stillwell revalidation.
Yeah, so SWR is already implemented, and it was supposed to be released Q1 of this year. Is Q1 over? It's over today.
No.
Or no?
It's over in the month.
Oh, it's over.
One
It's
more
over
month.
the end of the month. Okay, so yeah, the release window, I guess, is supposed to be this month. They might miss it, but I can't imagine it's not going to come out this year or in the next couple months.
So once that's released, I think we are able to have the same behavior as Vercel. But right now, we'll make a request. That response will be cached for, by default, 10 seconds. You can configure that in the in your app. But after 10 seconds, after the cache is expired, next request will be slower. It's generating the page on demand. So that's a difference right now. But hopefully we get the same behavior by the end of the month when SWR comes out.
If SWR comes out in AWS, would you even use ISR, or we just use the SWR headers?
I don't know it on top of my head.
Okay.
But I think in the new framework, I think all these requests are just based on different request header behaviors.
Yeah. Okay. We've got a question. Any plans on GCP and Azure? So this is a bit further into the future. So again, even more speculative, I guess. But our approach, and Dax has sort of dropped some hints on this already. Our approach is to try and think about, the world of development through kind of the best parts. And in our mind, the best parts are sort of the serverless parts. And so when we look at GCP or Azure or any other service for that matter, so, the sort of PlanetScales of the world, the Cloudflares of the world, we think about it in those terms. And one of the reasons why we haven't done a ton with GCP or Azure is because some of their serverless offerings aren't maybe on par with AWS. As much as we like to beat up on AWS, they're way better than some of these other guys. But this is a thing that we do have in mind, is at some point being able to expand and support some of these other providers natively. And again, not just GCP and Azure, but some of the other more exciting serverless sort of providers out there. Going along, I think this is a question for you, Frank. Is it possible to deploy API lambdas to a specific VPC to access pre-existing resources?
I think Michael kind of answered the question. And
yeah.
I think I shared the link in the chat.
Okay.
It is possible, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you can set it on the function level, and you can set it if the construct has multiple functions like the API. You can set it as a default for the API, or even across entire stack or entire app.
Yeah, I think Ashish had another question. Will Auth have any scope to deal with IAM level scoping for resources, or will it be limited to user authentication and authorization?
Yeah, so that pattern of using IAM to like grant users direct access to certain AWS resources, I found that to be a pattern that I don't really like. In practice, like where does this actually really show up? Like you're not going to grant a user access to like your database. So that that's like not a practical thing that shows up. It does show up for like, uploading files to a bucket. I don't think it shows up in too many other places. So, and IAM is confusing, and it's like I don't think it's a right abstraction for people to think through. So today, auth is only going to do authentication. So we're going to tell you who this person is. Any authorization of like figuring out permissions and things like that, that's up to you to figure out how you want to implement. Down the road, though, I want to also cover that. I see these as two completely separate things. Like I think complement each other, but like I think authorization can be implemented pretty differently and is not really tied to any authentication implementation. There's a way that I do it in my own apps that I think works really well. It's kind of based on like effectively like they're like asserts. So in your application code, you'll do stuff like, assert user can create to do, and that will throw an exception if the currently authenticated person is not able to do that. I mean, it might be a person, it might be an API key, it might be like whatever. So it's not tied to the actual authentication side. And they'll throw an exception that'll bubble up and return a proper error in your API. That's how I currently do it. I don't use any of the IAM stuff at all. For bucket uploads, I do pre-signed URLs. I find those work better anyway. So yeah, I'm staying away from, just given Cognito is just like the difficulty we've had with it, I'm staying away from the AWS side for both the auth and authorization, the authentication and authorization piece.
Yeah, I do have a little bit to add to that. We've been in the AWS ecosystem for a really long time, and one of the patterns we notice with a lot of the AWS teams is that they build services and then they get feature requests for those services or how those services work with some other services, some of the other AWS services, that is. And a lot of times they tend to think in terms of the scope of like AWS as an island. And so they have features that address those feature requests, but in a very AWS specific way. And sometimes like that sort of makes sense or it works. But what we've found is in the long run, if you work to essentially redesign your app to sort of support that, you're at odds with some of the other standards-based approaches that you find in the open source world in general. And so, again, it's not strictly true across the board, but a pattern like using IAM to sort of like manage your permissions outside of your application or outside of your application code, that ends up being problematic because then over time you have to rely on it to do, let's say, any other sort of role-based access for the rest of your app. So now you're sort of like buying into that. And again, in some cases, in sort of limited scopes where you clearly understand, oh, I'm not going to grow past this, that ends up being fine. But the more tightly coupled it is, the harder it is over time for you to add sort of newer features or newer functionality and possibly even swap certain parts of your system out. So that is an area that we try to be very careful in sort of picking or recommending, is because it does lead to some issues down the road. Let's see here. I think we've got just one other one. How in detail is auth documented? They created IAM roles anywhere for this. Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because it's like, because they get asked more and more on, oh, how do I continue to sort of, okay, if I'm using the system that you have created for us for this feature request, how do I do X? They build on it more and more. I think the advantage that we get sometimes is we get to take a step back and be like, all right, fundamentally, what are we actually trying to do with auth? And is there a model that we can sort of use that would, again, I was sort of saying, is a little bit more standards based? So yeah, so it's one of those cases where like they have to commit to the path that they've chosen, and yeah, again, if their design choices aren't great up front, it can lead to a little bit of pain down the road. Our approach has been fairly straightforward in that, like, because you can use CDK with us, you should be able to do it yourself. So we're not going to stop you from using whatever you want to use, but if we had a choice of designing it up front, then we would try and pick one that works well with the rest of sort of the open source world.
Yeah, ultimately, we don't have too many ideas on what we could improve on top of the IAM Cognito model. Like, we've done what we can, and there's not much more. So you can still use that model if that's what you want to do. But yeah, we don't have a ton of ideas. The new auth, I haven't actually put a working example of this yet, but technically SST auth can be used by like the native authorizers in AWS. So AWS has this thing called a JWT authorizer, which effectively you can point it at any compliant external author, like OAuth implementation. And in our case, ST auth is compliant, so you can point it, and then so now you can just use like the JWT authorizer in front of your API gateway if you like using the AWS native versions of this, which I think some people were trying to do with the existing SST auth as it is today.
There's another question on how in detail is auth documented in the SST2 docs. Really interested in learning how it's built and the trade-offs you made. So we've got sort of the first version of auth, and we have that documented. But I kind of have a follow-up on this one if you're around, Vincent. If you could tell me a little bit more in detail of what you're sort of looking for. So when we go write the docs for it, which we are going to, we'll try and make sure that we sort of cover that. So yeah, so if you've got a second, put that sort of in the chat. Let's see. AuthZ, OpenFGA, Hero are the future. If you want a strong authorization model, I am anywhere. Is there a new? Yeah, I think one of the, and Dax can sort of talk to this. This had happened with the first version of auth. Was the sort of light bulb moment for us when we kind of realized that you're actually trying to solve for two different problems here: authentication and authorization. And the trouble really starts when you couple the two of them tightly together and try to solve that as one product. And so yeah, so anyway, so that's been sort of a revelation for us.
Yeah, I think the most repeatable work across everyone's apps is the authentication part. I think the authorization part people tend to have more opinions about. But yeah, there are standards for that, like Richard just mentioned.
Cool. I think that's it. Any other questions? If anybody's got anything else, feel free to sort of drop that in there. Yeah. What Richard's sort of saying, it's like, yeah, you can put them together, and that's kind of how like people tend to do it up front and how they sort of solve for it. But that if you do that as a provider, like in the case of Cognito on some level, or whatever they've sort of done in the various sort of implementations, you get caught in a position where you're now having to kind of support that in a way that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And that's where a lot of the pain sort of comes from. But yeah, I think that is it. I don't think we've got any other questions. Did you guys have anything you wanted to talk about?
No, I think that's everything. Good questions.
Yeah. We'll be around on Discord. The one thing we had sort of done, so if you haven't heard about SST2 so far, or like this is kind of new to you, or you haven't had a chance to upgrade, I would kind of touch on this, that SST2 has been out for a little bit, and this is something that we sort of like doing, is getting it out there, being upfront and trying to solve all the issues. And then when we do kind of a launch, hey, it's already in production. This isn't a thing that we're just dropping on and it's unfinished. It's actually been in use for a little bit, and that'll happen with auth as well. Kind of like what Dax was saying with Dax and Adam's sort of project. We're piloting auth out there as is, and by the time it's sort of released and ready, it'll already be in use, and that's been the case with SST2. Actually, the console that is, so the order I was kind of saying was the drop-in mode stuff, auth, and then we'll go and work on the console again.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. And we will end the stream. See ya.
See you, everybody.